Hello, my name is Craig Bryan. I'm a clinical psychologist and the Associate Director of the National Center for Veteran Studies at the University of Utah. What we do at the National Center for Veteran Studies is conduct research focusing primarily on veterans' health and well-being, and then we also educate and train both mental health professionals, the general population, the general public, on how to improve veterans' health and success in life. Today, what I wanted to discuss briefly is a new study that was recently published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. The title of this study is called Trajectories of Trauma, Symptoms, and Resilience in Deployed U.S. Military Service Members, a Prospective Cohort Study. This study was actually conducted by George Bonanno and several colleagues as part of the Millennium Cohort Study. What the Millennium Cohort Study is, it's a longitudinal study focused on all services and all branches of military within the United States Armed Forces. And what's nice about this study is that it's a representative sample of the United States military. So what that means is it's not just, taking service members from, the unit down the street or whatever is convenient on hand, but instead we've selected service members across the entire United States military that reflect sort of the gender distribution, age distribution, geographic location, etc. So we have a really nice idea of how these issues affect the military as a whole. And so they started this study in 2001 and have been tracking service members for the 10 years since. So this is a very large-scale, long-term health surveillance study. And what they did in this particular study is they wanted to look at how does PTSD sort of emerge amongst United States service members over time. Does it improve? Does it get worse? Does it stay stable? And are there different types of responses to PTSD that we can identify amongst military personnel? And so they used some very advanced statistical methods to figure that out. And what they found actually was quite interesting. Is they looked at those who had deployed, and then they also looked at those who had deployed multiple times during the past 10 years. And what's nice about this study is because they started in 2001, before we started all of the high levels of deployments that we've seen in the past 10 years, we actually now have sort of a baseline. Where did service members start before they started to do all of these deployments? And what they found in this study was quite remarkable. First, they found that about 83% of U.S. service members who had deployed one time in the past 10 years actually sustained very low levels of PTSD and did not seem to worsen. So this is kind of interesting because most of the statistics that you probably hear in the past several years, about 15 to 20% of service members who have deployed have PTSD. And actually that's what they found in this study. But what most people don't talk about is that if 15% have PTSD, 85% do not. And they found this similar pattern amongst U.S. military service members for up to several years. Over time, they remained very low PTSD-free, even with deployments. They also found in this single deployer group that about 6 to 7% started off without PTSD, but emerged. It developed and it slowly increased over the course of several years. They called this the worsening chronic group. We also found that about 2% of the military start with PTSD very high to begin with, and they keep that high level of PTSD over time. That's called the high stable group. And then there was this fourth group that was kind of in the middle. They had sort of a moderate level of PTSD symptoms to begin with, but over the course of several years after the deployment, their PTSD symptoms actually improved over time. And so amongst those who have deployed once in the military, we can now identify 4 different groups or trajectories over time. The vast majority of them, 85%, remain healthy, do not show high levels of PTSD over time. But a much smaller percentage, 2%, have high PTSD symptoms to begin with, and they continue to show very high levels of PTSD over time. And then as another small percentage, about 7%, start off with no PTSD or very low levels of PTSD but get worse over time. What this group also did is they looked at the impact or these trajectories of PTSD over time with multiple deployments. So maybe those who have deployed only once have a very different profile or very different emergence of PTSD over time versus those who are repeatedly, numerously deployed 2, 3, or maybe even 4 times. What's kind of interesting was in this study they found similar patterns. Again, around 85% of service members who have deployed several times show very low levels of PTSD that stay very low for several years over time, even with multiple deployments. And we find, again, that 2% number who have very high levels to begin with. But what's interesting is in the multiple deployers, those high levels started to come down over time. And then we again saw another small percentage, about 5%, who start low with PTSD and they get worse over time. And so we see very similar patterns amongst those who have deployed only once versus those who have deployed multiple times. And so kind of the implications of this study, sort of what this all means, right, is that the overwhelming majority of service members who have deployed, whether only once or multiple times, tend not to show high levels of PTSD. They start off healthy and they remain healthy over many years. But there is a small percentage of service members who do show increased health problems specific to PTSD subsequent to their deployments over time. Many of these service members will improve. Now, we don't know if the service members improved because they were in treatment or was it just a natural recovery. This study cannot answer that question. But what we do know is that the majority of those who do show PTSD symptoms will improve over the course of time, which is very good news. And this is consistent with what we know about treatments for PTSD, is that there's a very high recovery rate. 75 to 80% of people with PTSD who receive prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy for PTSD will actually recover and no longer meet PTSD criteria any longer. So very good news, very different approach to looking at how PTSD emerges within the military over time. And I think this will go a long way for helping us to understand who's most vulnerable to developing PTSD and other things that we can do to sort of target these higher risk groups from the very beginning to reduce the likelihood of them developing PTSD over time.